Hey Yorba Linda, so today's episode is by far the most important episode I have ever made in terms of the future of our city. So if you live in this city, please make sure you watch this. If you know anybody else that lives in it and you find this information useful, please consider sharing it as well. So on today's episode, I'm sitting down with Nate Farnsworth. He is the Community Development Director of Yorba Linda, and we're going to be discussing something on everybody's mind as we get closer to the election, which is Measure JJ. So if you're voting and you're from Yorba Linda, you're going to see this on your ballot. And I want to make sure you have the information you need to make an educated decision when you go and vote for this, because it has a huge impact on what happens in the future of Yorba Linda. And this is a nonpartisan channel, but basically it's going to come down to whether you want Yorba Linda to retain control of what we want to do with housing in the future, or if you want to give that control up to the state builders and developers so they can figure out what they want to do with our city. And also, as a bonus, if you stick around to the end of the episode, we also briefly discuss Measure KK as well, so that way you have a little bit more information on exactly what that is. So let's go ahead and get into it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So today I'm here with Nate Farnsworth. He is the Community Development Director of Yorba Linda. So Nate, thank you for joining me on this important episode today.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for the invitation to come out and talk with you about this.
Absolutely. So I mentioned this in the intro, but I just want to mention it again. Are you able to tell voters how to vote in this election with this?
No, we can't tell voters how to vote, but we can certainly provide information to voters that will help them make their decision for themselves.
Got it. And like I said, this is a nonpartisan thing. I just want to be able to get information out to the community so you can be informed when you go to the ballot and cast that ballot, because it's a very consequential election, especially when it comes to this measure. So speaking of, can you give us the briefest description you can while still kind of letting people know what it is? What is Measure JJ?
Sure. So let me just give a little bit of context to this, Josh.
Okay.
The state of California every 8 years requires all jurisdictions throughout the state of California to come up with a local housing plan that meets state law. That what it will do is it requires cities to plan for a certain number of housing units that are assigned by the state.
Yep.
That will cover the course of that 8-year period of time. And what the city has to do is essentially demonstrate that it can provide for the ability for those new housing units to be built over the course of that 8-year cycle.
Okay.
Now, there's no requirement that those housing units are actually built.
Yep.
That's the goal
from
the state, but essentially that's where things start. And so Measure JJ is essentially the city's attempt to comply with state housing law. One other unique thing about Yorba Linda is that Yorba Linda has what's called the Yorba Linda Right to Vote Initiative, which is also commonly referred to as Measure B, which essentially is that when any sort of zoning takes place in the city that increases the residential density, not only does the council vote on it, but the residents are given an opportunity to vote on it.
Okay.
So you have
that's a pretty unique thing in terms of a lot of cities don't really have that. It's kind of the council votes on it and that's it, where we have a little bit more residential involvement when people are trying to get these things changed.
Correct.
Okay.
And so in this situation, the state's mandating that the city rezone property to allow for more housing development. The city has an obligation to put that in front of the voters. And so this Measure JJ is really an opportunity for voters to weigh in on their thoughts on this and why they may or may not want to support this.
Okay, so in terms of, let's kind of go over quickly what the consequences are in terms of if this passes or it doesn't pass. So let's go ahead and first start with if this passes. What exactly does that mean for Yorba Linda?
Sure, so if Measure JJ passes, the city will remain in compliance with state law. And that's important because in order to, you want to have what's called a housing element certification from the state. If you have that certification, it keeps you safe from a whole bunch of penalties that we'll talk about if this fails. Having a certified housing element, though, is important to keep you out of trouble from the state for all of these different consequences. We currently have a certified housing element, and so the question in November will really be whether or not the voters want to support this Measure JJ, which will help us to retain our housing element certification. A no vote on Measure JJ will result very quickly in a loss of our housing element certification.
Okay, and that's kind of want to go over because I feel like that's probably the most important part of this whole thing is what are those consequences if this doesn't pass this time?
Yeah, so if Measure JJ fails, as I mentioned, the state will very quickly come in and decertify the city's housing element. And the problem with that, the biggest problem is what's called builder's remedy. Builder's remedy is basically a law that for cities that don't have a certified housing element, it allows for developers to come in and regardless of whatever local regulations for land use exist within the city, developers can bypass that under state regulations and build, in many respects, what they want to build regardless of local regulations and local laws. So we're talking specifically about increasing densities far above and beyond what the city has ever seen before. And also building height is another one that local control would be lost with that respect as well.
Okay, and obviously one of the draws to Yorba Linda is it's a more spread out city. There's less dense populations throughout the city, whereas this builder's remedy that you're talking about, they can come in and I mean, they could build a 10-story building if they wanted to because we would be uncertified at that point. And we basically lose control as a city to be able to really tell everybody around the city in terms of zoning what they should and shouldn't be doing. It'd be going into the state dictates it, and obviously when builder's remedy comes in, they can kind of do whatever they want. So is that kind of a general summary of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, Josh. It really comes down to a yes vote on Measure JJ is a vote for local control. No vote on Measure JJ essentially will eventually lead to granting that local control back to the state.
Okay, and then in terms of the financial cost to that, so if it doesn't pass, I believe there's some penalties involved as well that Yorba Linda could be facing if that doesn't pass as well.
Yeah, cities that don't have a certified housing element are subject to penalties of up to $600,000 per month.
Wow, okay.
And I think what's important to understand with that one too is that you don't get the option of just paying the fine and then that's it. You get to not have to do your zoning. You have to pay the fine and you still have to do the zoning. So.
Okay. So it could definitely be, especially coming out of the budget, that's going to be things that are going to be cut around the rest of the city because we're paying those fines as well.
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, overall, it kind of sounds like, no, obviously in Yorba Linda, a lot of people don't want any extra housing ever, and that's in most cities because it creates more traffic. However, it seems like having the local control over it versus having the state and the builders control over it would be advantageous in terms of what I see it as. However, it's going to be up to you, the voter, to be able to decide. So this is just a very brief summary of this whole measure. If you want to get a lot more information, get the full details, you've done a lot of community events and kind of gone over for an hour and a half about all the different things, answering questions. But if someone wants to get more informed about this, what's the best place they can go to really deep dive into this issue and figure out all the pros and cons for themselves?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that, Josh. I would say that there's two websites that would be important for people to consider looking at. If you want the short version, the simple understanding of all of this, we have a website called ylmeasurejj.com. And that just sort of gives a basic overview of Measure JJ. Yeah, so the other website that people might want to check out if they want to do a real deep dive into this, Josh, would be yllocalcontrol.com. That one has a lot of resources that are there, including some pre-recorded videos where we really get into a lot of the details of the background of all of this. So those two websites would be really helpful for people to check out that have questions.
Okay, and like I said, I highly recommend you definitely check that out. Now, before I let you go, the last thing that I want to talk about is because it's something that really comes up often when I talk about the Measure JJ with anybody in the community is Measure KK. So obviously it's a little bit different, but if we can give the voters maybe a little brief update on the facts on that, just so people understand what Measure KK is, as well as at least getting to understand it before they start going to the ballot box.
So Measure KK is, in simple terms, is really just the property owner has a desire to change the zoning of their property, which is currently zoned commercial. They've requested to change the zoning of that to allow for up to 30 units per acre of residential development, plus a mixed use component, which would be residential plus commercial. So that's their proposal, and they're presenting that to the voters to give them a chance to weigh in as to whether or not they would support that upzoning just of that one property.
Okay, and that's really in the Bryant Ranch area where the ice rink is right now, correct?
Correct, the Bryant Ranch Shopping Center, and they're really, Measure JJ and KK are really very distinct from one another. They just happen to be on the ballot at the same time.
That was my next question, are they the same thing or something a little bit different on there? Okay, perfect. Well, If you haven't already, again, I highly recommend making sure that you check out all the information around these measures, do your own research, but it's something that you want to make sure that you stay informed, because those mail-in ballots are going out pretty soon, I think as early as the beginning of October. So you really want to make sure you have this information at your fingertips and you have it to be able to make that vote an educational vote versus something that you're just hearing this hearsay or something that might not be true. Look at the facts and make sure you vote based on what you feel is right. So Nate, thank you again for joining me today. And everybody, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you on the next show. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.